Thank you. Well, fantastic. So really lots to think about here. And do you want to start by, do you have any comments or reflections on each other's? We have quite a long time to talk, so there's going to be plenty of room to open it up as well. But I thought I would like to offer you the chance to, if you want to comment on each other's.
Well, I thought we were all brilliant. But one thing, I thought it was interesting how the way you use neutrality and the way I'm using it is very, very different, and yet they both apply to modernism. And I think another thing too is how flexible modernism is, and that it really just can go in any direction depending on the time and the context. So it seems like it's one thing, but it really isn't. Yeah, in terms of neutrality, you're really looking at it as a way of propagandizing the United States, and in this sort of soft way, where for Cunningham, neutrality is this blank space that the viewer then can put any kind of meaning on it that he or she wants. So, but I think in both situations, neutrality is something that could protect you. I mean, that's the idea, is to protect you, but makes whether it's a country or an aesthetic very vulnerable, because it's easy to be pressured in one way or another. So that's kind of where they come together, I think. But anyway, so that's just.
I was struck by the question, is it okay to dance on graves, because of the Soviet German history, which is so often left out of post-Cold War narratives. Do people know that they're dancing on, so we say, Russian graves?
I mean, I think it's interesting to come with that question back to what Gay said, like to talk about the issue of the neutrality of specific approaches of dancing, because it is there as also that Shamat seemingly takes the postmodern and the modern and casts it as an apolitical against a highly politicized backdrop. So it's similar to what you both talked about, and it's really important to talk about, like, when is that done? When is neutrality is connected to universalization, which seems to be cast as something apolitical, or when it is really utilized as an apolitical stance, and when is it done through the technique or through the framing or through the diplomacy that you mentioned there. And I think it's very interesting to point that out in all those instances, and it's not even inside of one approach consistent. So I find that also very interesting in how all three issues really discussed that or brought that forward. So I'm really interested in looking actually at not just at the framing, but also the actual technique, how that in itself allowed some of those seemingly neutral stances, and how that is undermined then by the framing of the event or the actual choreographic setup. So I find that very striking.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this idea of technique. As you say, and Cunningham had his technique and Graham had her technique, and this idea that Graham's technique is universal because it's built on the breath, in and out, and that you only move a limb when it's motivated by the pelvis, because all life is motivated by the pelvis and all of this stuff. Although then by the 60s, it's an absolute, teacher can say and everybody knows, boom, 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 right? And everybody knows what to do. And Doris Humphrey in '58 writes The Art of Making Dances, which defines what a good modern dance and a bad modern dance is, which completely blows apart the idea of modernism as avant, right? Because
Oh,
if there's a
because
good
it's
one and a bad one,
institutionalized,
because
yeah.
it's institutionalized. Graham is
Yeah.
institutionalized, modern dance is institutionalized, and that's why Graham says, I'm not modern, because she doesn't want to fit into that. But then says she's modern abroad, because that gives her the currency to bring the frontier.
Right.
Because there's no language.
Which makes it really important to really look at that concept of modern, how it is rethought constantly and
Constantly,
constantly
yeah.
re-evaluated
Matured.
rather than staying a monolithic issue. And that was part also of the text that I sent out, like where I tried to establish how socialist realism, even though it's very often seen as that counterpart to modernist aesthetic, actually had modernist tendency and was engaging with modernist structures, depending how you're defining them. And I think you can do that for some of the other counters to modernism as well, depending on the time and the framing. So you raised your hand.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying something similar, that modern in the US context and the way it's then sort of latched onto the dance is quite different also from how modern would have been read in terms of expressionist German dance into modern, as that term is really used in the German context. And then the universalism is also quite problematic
Yes.
in many ways, and especially I guess in the context of Cold War politics. So yes, I was quite interested in your idea of the potentialities of Cold War histories, to sort of read this a bit against the grain. As you were just suggesting, we could look at social realism
Right.
as modernist, and also sort of the somewhat silenced history of Trapdoor Park, where, you know, if we look at Charmants, and this whole question of dance and diplomacy is so interesting. And also just recently we see dance coming up again in our current context in the media, sort of as a political tool for for sort of saving everything, in the way that Martha Graham was touring the world at a time where possibly in the US she was always sort of on the decline, but toured around as this sort of prototype of a modernism that was already in decline or lost. As opposed to Cunningham. And what's interesting that they're still sort of doing their work at the same time in New York, and both sort of representing different facets of modernism, if that's even a useful term. Sometimes I think it's not even a useful term to use describing their aesthetic. So yeah, but maybe Rent, could you say a bit more about the potentialities? Because I felt what your thinking is around that.
I mean, I'm what I try to do here with the thoughts at the end, which works also in relation to some of the issues that I'm looking at right now, in relation to collective guilt, in relation to racial politics in the U.S. and also like Holocaust issues in Germany, and how the East Germans were kept out of that collective guilt for quite a while and had to address it then later and never fully addressed it, and how that might have caused some of the issues that we are facing also now in Germany. So I find it interesting to look at the possibility of not just engaging, as I said, with those artistic productions or those artistic structures thematically, but also structurally. So like to see how they are relating to some of the other issues that we thought we already thought through. And think again about those Cold War moments structurally, and how they relate to them or not relate to them, and what kind of markers are there that we seemingly are identifying for those other things in those Cold War artistic productions, and that might be more important than just bringing them back and restaging that. We had like an event in New York with Radmansky, who has restaged some of those socialist realist ballets, but I never heard him really talking about the issues that this structurally brings up. Like they are really clearly reconstructed, like they are basically restaged in the way that he does them, and then brought to an American audience who is not capable, because there's no framing for them to really engage with this kind of material. And I'm not even sure that the audience, the current audience in Russia is fully able to engage with them now. So I find it interesting to find ways how are you dealing with this material, but by opening it up in order to not think like it's this concluded thing that we just bring back as this thing, and then by this we can like look at it melancholically or bring it into the chronology of events, and by taking it out of it, I feel like we can open it up also. And that's also possible for the ways that you are talking about. I find it really interesting when you suddenly start talking about age or so, which clearly then age or race or gender or so, which clearly takes it out of the universal, because as soon as you are making that visible or so, it takes it out of that. Or when you talked about the Cunningham, I remember going to that burial event at the Armory, where it clearly was no longer about an individual experience of it, because it was this collective performance of mourning for Cunningham. So it had a completely different function than I any time have seen Cunningham before. So, and it became really a collective moment, and it was my favorite Cunningham performance of all of them that I ever seen. So I found that very interesting. So these are ways of like, does it answer a little bit like, or opens up a little bit possibility of?
Can I ask a quick question for Gay?
Yeah. Yes.
I have never been able to explain, Cunningham seems like the perfect Cold War export. But the dance panel, I mean, he has horrific stories about how he was treated by the dance panel, basically not sent out. One time he was being awarded something in France, and the State Department showed up to the award ceremony, took the award, and disappeared with it and sent it back to him in New York, parcel post due. You know, they're just horrible stories about the way the State Department treated him. When it seemed, and they exported John Cage, so it seems, I've always said it's the personalities of the people on the dance panel that didn't want to send him. And it's artistic taste of those people who happened to be there, but is it something, can we identify something larger?
Well, I think that a lot of people couldn't see any meaning in it at all, and that was part of it too. That they didn't get the idea that they were supposed to imbue it with this meaning. I mean, it's not that he didn't have any meaning. As far as he was personally concerned, a lot of the work was quite personal, really, but he didn't talk about it. That was never part of what he did, and chance was part of the reason for trying to counteract any kind of personal message of any kind. But I mean, I can remember going to Cunningham performances probably in the late 70s or early 80s. People were still walking out. They would hear that electronic score, and they would see something on the stage, and they didn't know what it meant, and after a while they'd leave. I mean, and so I think that he was just considered too dangerous to send. Dangerous from boredom, I mean, not dangerous. Because these other things, aspects of it just weren't understood at all. He just wasn't accessible enough. And in my book, I talk a lot about that, the idea of the critique of rationalization. Well, that really, I mean, no one talked about it. No critic talked about it. Nobody ever talked about it. So I think it just took audiences a very, very long time to come to grips with what they were supposed to be doing, because he didn't talk about that much either. I mean, he made some comments, but he didn't make a lot. But I think also the dance panel was made up of people who I think came from an earlier generation, wasn't Doris Humphrey on that? I think
For a
She
while,
was.
and Christine.
Yeah.
She died. She died while she was on it.
Yeah.
I mean, she
So,
to her death.
and was Lincoln Kirstein
Yeah,
on it?
Kirstein
Yeah,
was on
well,
it.
I
Mhm.
mean,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
although
Mhm.
he actually invited Cunningham
Mhm.
to perform
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
his company before it was New York City Ballet.
But I think it's also a perception of the American perception of what the rest of the world can.
That's
can,
right. Yeah, it's a kind of
perceive.
that.
Yes, it's just
it
really
is a sort of yeah,
um,
exactly.
whether it's superiority or elitism.
Yeah.
In something like that, they
Something else.
they don't get it.
Yeah.
So when
Not
Jerome Robbins
accessible enough.
choreographed a piece to silence, a piece called Moves, after he rejected, he said, I don't have time to choreograph to Aaron Copland's score, which was commissioned for him. The head of ANTA was saying, well, you can only perform it in these particular countries because Yugoslavia and some of the other ones aren't sophisticated enough to get
Yeah.
it.
Those
So
are sort of-
and then there was this big back and forth there. So, but I think that kind of an imperial, or I don't know, whatever you call it,
Yeah,
type of attitude.
One of the things that I always forget with Martha Graham is this vital element of the lecture demonstration, where she puts the dancers in front of everybody, she explains the technique, this is how you do it, this is why we do it, this is, and so, I mean, she went out of her way. And the State Department at one point would send her to countries in the 70s only to do lecture demonstrations, no evening performance.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's how valuable that seemed to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Any other questions?
More than a question, probably something that resonated with me with Gay when you were talking about in the last part of your presentation about Cunningham being read against a neoliberal backdrop in a way, and it brought up Jan and Aleida Asman's work on cultural memory and how they define vinculated memory as one of the constitutive society, one of the forms of memory that constitute society. And so in the moment in which there is no responsibility taken for the meaning, for the vision that is being conveyed, and this reduction to the individual projection of meaning, you are actually deleting and abolishing this vinculating memory in a way, no? And so there is something, not yourself, no, that's what Cunningham is doing. So there is definitely something about that neoliberal destruction of the common experience there.
I mean, I think it's very different for the dancers than the audience. The dancers are communicating with each other all the time, and they have a sense of community. But that's different from the audience.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's interesting too, because Graham said she makes it a communal experience because there's a universal body that we all have.
that's right. Yeah.
Right? And we all have a
exactly.
pelvis that moves, and we all have
Yeah.
lungs that go in and out, and that's why we're alive, and this is what the technique
Right.
is based on. And I can train any body, but then it becomes completely, it's almost militaristic, right?
Yeah.
By the end.
Yeah. But the whole idea of kinesthetic sympathy is the idea that, that's why you can send dancers all over the world, because everybody will understand.
Yeah.
Not necessarily true, but
That's
but
the
that
theory.
was kind of the theory, that you didn't need language because everyone could understand. But
Yeah, and Graham said that you don't have to know the myth of
That's
Medea
right.
to understand her pain the way I
Yeah.
tell it.
yeah,
Just because you bring this up about Cunningham coming to Europe, I think what also has to be understood in this context is the role of cultural narratives. So if you are in America, you have this culture that is based on immigration, and I always felt when I lived there, you don't need a common narrative, you have somehow learned to click into other people's narratives. And when I was in Europe, I had always, or being from Europe, I had always a feeling as a European I need much more a narrative to understand the art. And when Cage and Cunningham came to West Germany, there was actually a sort of environment to understand Cage's music with all this experimental music festival, Darmstadt, Donaueschingen and something. And I have still a video clip of a very like 70s TV program where Cunningham came as this addition to Cage, which then was well understood. And when I watched Cunningham as a dance student in the 1900 early 80s with all my mates, and we trained as contemporary dancers, we couldn't understand it, and the only thing I felt was a kinesthetic empathy. So I felt something was going on in the body, but I couldn't make head and heel other than this tickling in my muscles. And all my mates felt the same. And interestingly enough, when the wall came down, and I was exactly when the wall fell in New York, and when I came back, I started to sort of teach dance history first at the Humboldt University in East Berlin. And it was actually a really interesting experience because my East German students had so much more understanding of Cunningham and of Balanchine, while West German students still felt it's cold, you couldn't discuss it with them. But the East Berlin students felt such a liberation of watching Cunningham and Balanchine and this stuff and really embraced it. So there is also this kind of, how do I want to read something? Is it going against where I was brought up, or is it re-emphasizing it? So I think it's also, and if we think probably all over Europe and East and West, there were different ways of perceiving, and I think we have to take this also for granted and saying Cunningham was perceived like this, so it was very different whether you were East, West German, whether you had a musical background and so on, so forth, even within Germany.
I've always wondered if what Cunningham would have been if he'd never met Cage. You know, what is dance? It's hard to even imagine.
But you see this with Beach Birds when the music is different. People who come from a music or from outside perceive this as a completely different work than the Cage works.
You know, it's so interesting that you talked about the television programs and kind of the prepping of the field for Cage rather than Cunningham, because they did a lot of work prepping the field for Graham with television programs and movies and explanations in American houses and that kind of thing. And in the U.S., if everybody goes on YouTube, John Cage in this, I think around 60, is in a game show called What's My Line? Does anybody know? And it was a game show where the celebrity guessers, whatever they're called, are blindfolded and can't see the person, and the person describes their work and they have to guess what he does. And so Cage comes with some radios and a bathtub and a rubber ducky and all this kind of stuff. And they're tasked with figuring out what he does, and there's this whole discussion on What's My Line, kind of a U.S. game show about what is music. It's bizarre. But it's fascinating because no one does anything like that for Cunningham.
No.
Yeah, but is it a question of you have to do something for something, or is it not a question there is already a kind of intellectual framework there? I mean, if you think like there has been a post-war German tradition of experimental music, so there was a frame for Cage there, and there was an audience, and there were people who did this kind of work and really cherished Cage, while this kind of in West Germany not worked yet. There was a whole abolishment of German expressive dance. It was all like ballet.
Ballet.
Yeah, and so and Cunningham wasn't ballet, nor was he expressive dance. So it was much more difficult to place him and have this sort of experimental audience. And Graham always gave people a narrative and an expression, so people weren't left.
And your function as an audience member is also a different one in the two traditions.
Yeah.
So I think
exactly.
that comes exactly to what you are speaking, like that you're supposed to translate back what Graham was doing into
Yeah.
something, whereas this is not
Yeah.
your requirement there, it's not your function, and so you could
Yeah.
kinesthetically respond to it. So I find that also, and again, to your first question, again, in relation to neutrality, like, does this allow a kind of a neutrality when you're supposed to translate it into something that is shared in its response, whereas this is not?
Right. Right.
And how is that structurally set inside of the technique and the way that it is performed?
Yeah, for Graham, everyone was supposed to, in the end, feel the same
Right.
grief,
Right.
celebration,
Whatever
it was,
she brings
whatever the
forward.
story was.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to thank you so much. So exciting this discussion. I was wondering if we could continue to elaborate a little more on this function of neutrality and the labor that gets into producing something to look like it is not there. This heavily produced, heavily intense, labored to create the neutral, and how that may be connected to this sort of the West Side, the notion of democracy, something that is available to everyone. So as you say, like everybody has a body, so everybody can have democracy, right? So and then in unpicking these notions, the different ways in which one can labor intensively to produce the effortlessness, the neutral. Perhaps 3 questions that we might ask. You can pick one or 2 or 3. So the first is then the how it functions, so the technique, perhaps the mechanics of it. Secondly, how it functions. So how it functions on stage, choreographically, in the vision of the artist. And thirdly, perhaps we can ask ourselves the effects that this produces, and perhaps how has been utilized by state propaganda, how then the state or others see that might produce X, Y, and Z effects, which may or may not be in synchronicity with what the artist originally intended, nonetheless produce effects in the audience, and it produce such effects that you can take abroad, and then you can export neutrality in relationship to the notion of democracy, even if you might be bombing people. So I mean, it's a very big question, but but anything about this neutrality and democracy, perhaps the mechanics, the functionality, or the effects.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying this about Cunningham. I mean, I don't know what his attitude was, but I would think that it would be that his dance was democratic in the sense that it allowed everyone as an individual to create whatever meaning they wanted. So that is a sort of individual freedom, because in the United States there's always this tendency to go in the direction of the individual, except for specific periods of time, like the 1930s, say, that the individual, if you look at our Constitution, everything, it's always about individual freedom. And so Cunningham could conceivably be about individual freedom. So that's...
But what's the label underneath? Because it isn't. The United States is not a democratic country, I'm sorry.
Oh, well,
no,
of course not.
Yeah, but so I'm interested in the labor in producing that, which is not.
Yeah.
So, okay.
All right. So when I watch Martha Graham try to be apolitical, it is exhausting.
Well,
right?
that's
Because
the
there
thing.
is so much. So I think we've got to parse out what we mean when we say apolitical and what we mean when we say neutral, because I think the two are very different. So I think when apolitical is this idea of one-size-fits-all democracy, right? So it's these people, and it's fascinating to listen to politicians say that we're going to install democracy, as though this is kind of something that because it's universal and because it's, kind of all this stuff, that it will just fit everybody, right? You just install it and it works. And I think Graham goes out of her way to remove herself from the politics of this so she can seem like the one-size-fits-all democracy. And her technique functions like that because it's of the breath or the having sex. So there's the technique, and then the choreography is it's individual. So she has her own individual technique, and the other, Cunningham has his, and this one, Jose Limon has theirs. And they're all of the individual body, but what they all do is tap into a universal, right? A universal truth. So it's very Jungian, right? So if you just go deep enough into your humanity, you will be like everyone else because you're telling, she calls it blood memory. You will tap into the blood that is we all share for thousands of years. Now this comes back to bite her in the butt, right? Excuse my language. Because in that is that she's going to come and bring you the technique. She's going to train anybody, literally, with this boom, right? And it's going to work on stage because her things are her things, but we're all going to understand it because we're all human. But then the problem becomes in how do you teach choreography, right? Because if it's of the individual, then you have the technique and you go out and make your own dances, right? Because you're free and you're individual and you have a voice and now you have technique, okay? But, so she leaves Iran in 1956 and says, and Vietnam in 1974, and she preaches to the students, and she says, you students, now you have a technique, and you now have free speech. Well, this is not a good thing for the United States, right? Because in Iran, free speech means, please leave your installed democracy at home, because it looks like a shot at me. And in Vietnam, it looks like the American War, not the Vietnam War. Right? So it's really complicated in terms of what she's saying and then what she says on the ground and then how it absolutely backfires. So what do? 56? We just don't send her back to Iran. She just never goes there again. So it's really labor intensive to be apolitical, and then when you get into a neutral place, it's even harder because you can't take a stand. So when she goes to Finland and Yugoslavia, she doesn't bring Appalachian Spring. She doesn't bring frontier. She only brings the mythic and the abstract. It's heavily curated.
The other thing is, this is all theory. It's not what's actually going on.
Right.
So that's. This is the American theory. It's not what's actually being danced or what's actually being promoted. So it's
what's being received.
Not being, yeah, exactly.
So I was just thinking about what Jens was saying about the denazification process and Graham in West Berlin in 1957, and it looks absurd because she goes in as Judith, which is the story of the woman who takes off the invader's head and saves the Jewish people. And she takes her Noguchi tent and she changes it from a royal color to mustard yellow. And then she comes out at the end with her peace offering. And people don't like it. She gets terrible reviews. And you think, okay, this is there's somebody has to have planned this for her to change the color, to come with that particular dance. There's lots of discussion in the dance panel about other people who want to go. They just put her in there. And it occurs to me that maybe there was a thought. They also were trying to get East Germans into that auditorium. So they gave tickets away in East Germany. And Martha Graham is celebrated in the dance panel meetings because she got 25% of the audience from East Germany. So maybe there was some thought that that this message is for East German consumption, but it didn't work because it was performed in West Germany, even though there were East Germans in the audience who were absolutely not going to like modern dance because it was American. It was promoted as so American, right?
Which points towards your question, like what kind of definition of democracy are we using?
That's
right.
And we have to, in all those, not only in every locality, but also in over the time periods that we are talking, that is such a shift in concept and is performed in such different ways and structured in such different ways that it is, you have to really look at it and again, in singularity and in relation to dominant understandings of it, or how it is retrospectively structured or understood. So that's quite important as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I think of this Judy piece, you're going somewhere down a wrong line. I think on the one hand you have to think maybe it's deliberate to send a piece like this
Yeah, it was
to
absolutely
show
deliberate.
the Germans, okay, we won't forget what you have done and you better don't forget it. But at the same time you have to think Germany 57 is, well, the Nazis didn't disappear. I mean, it was a country still more run by the same people, except a few key figures you had to sort of publicly punish and set into put those trials up or anything, but you couldn't keep the country running if you would have made all the Nazis disappear. And it was really that, especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s in West Germany, people who were, so to speak, good Germans were even punished by those people who were still in office. And also this construction about East Germany, or that is one of the narratives, was this all the prosecuted communists would have collectively resettled themselves in East Germany, which is, not possible in terms of numbers or in terms of what actually happened.
In the 87, was she still sent to Berlin?
Yes.
For that thing?
She was sent to East Germany.
Because Cunningham was there at the same time. I think that's where I first saw Cunningham.
That's
as well.
really interesting.
So,
Yeah.
as part of that 750th anniversary. So,
that's
so I think that. So I wonder if both of them were sent, or if one of them was invited by Germans. And I don't know. There were competing programs in the West and in the East. So because they both celebrated Berlin's founding,
Right.
and they competed with who had the better program.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
was quite
And
important.
by 87, Cunningham was much more accepted
Yeah.
than
Right.
he was, in 1960.
Well, he wouldn't have come much to us, so that's why,
It's fascinating because I can't find the document that sends Graham to East Berlin, but it was clearly a part of that reunification program because the papers say it is. There's some possibility that Shepard Stone ran the Aspen Institute out of Berlin, and that he was offering the invitations and the money. So, but I cannot find a government document about this.
It's just so interesting to what you said, we received Graham really as a museum piece, whereas the
Yeah.
Cunningham was perceived really differently.
Yeah.
So it's exactly how you said. So that's why I'm also wondering how that was planned, that what we were supposed to see there.
Yeah. I can't find
Come back to your
Also
question.
in 57, she was, I don't know, she was still a bit newer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although there's apparently that's when Mary Wigman did Rite of Spring a few days later, and Graham went, and Graham was absolutely panned in the press for what she did, and Wigman was celebrated for Rite of Spring as kind of the new resurgence of Graham, of modern dance in Germany, which I thought was fascinating, and Graham takes that to heart.
Yeah, and then you have also to see it was always harder to get Limon classes than Graham classes later on. So I think it's quite a complex phenomenon.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
Is there any of that discussion, to turn it a little bit also to where we are, is there any discussion of those things, or revisiting of those Cold War issues here in the UK in relation to dance production or dance structuring or choreography programming?
Well, we were talking earlier about the kind of the dance platforms and who and kind of the politics of identity politics and the issues around that. But
I think I'm just really interested in this kind of dance that dance artists do or have to do to negotiate or exploit the political situation in which they're making work. And I wonder whether if we simplify the non-verbal nature of dance, whether it allows dance artists to sometimes get away with things that wouldn't be possible with other art forms which are overtly verbal. And yeah, I think it's probably also why
Do you have an example, Lisa?
well, kind of, yeah, I'm thinking sort of about the examples explored today, but I guess yeah, it kind of continues into the now. But I think, yeah, I'm interested, well, politicians are probably drawn to dance because of its non-verbal nature and its claim to the universal experience, because it can become a shortcut for something. And yeah, I guess what you've all been sort of talking about is this particular dance that specific dance artists have done to position themselves in relation to that.
You know, it's fascinating because in 1986-87, Graham goes back to the interwar dance that used words, and she does a premiere of American Document, which uses American documents, the Emancipation Proclamation, and so somebody speaks while the dancers dance, and I mean, Foucault couldn't make this up. She takes Baryshnikov, and she has him recite the Declaration of Independence on stage, and talks about this strategy to Barbara Bush, to promote Barbara Bush and say, now we need your name on this gala list. And then that's what starts to get her this tour to the Soviet Union, where she's going to take a film of Baryshnikov doing this. I mean, you really cannot make this up. And that's when she really gets shut down. But as Jens talks about, it's all about this, it's the Reagan bleeding into Bush nostalgia for kind of, you know, Americana, the great American, that in the end ends up absolutely not working. But then what the Cold War people, the people who worked, say, in radio and other things, what they say felled the Soviet Union wasn't economics, it wasn't this, it wasn't that, it was nationalism. So you took all the areas and all the states, and that the more nationalist you made them, which is why we broadcast in specific languages, the quicker they were going to revolt from Soviet Union as Russia. So you know, this whole question of language is absolutely a tactic we used, and when Martha Graham started to dabble in it again, it became really problematic.
Yeah, I think maybe just in response to Vicky's question about a specific example, I was thinking of the example that was in Jens's text that I had the opportunity to read as part of the forum beforehand, about Tom Schilling and the piece that you discuss, how it really didn't fit the sort of prescribed characteristics of what a social realist work should be like. It had lots of modern aspects to it. So that's what I mean with getting away with something, because actually the state officials were still supportive of the artistic outcome. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm kind of interested in how dance can push against those categories and sort of transform them through just what it is.
Maybe also like to update that a little bit into a contemporary one, like how you brought this, not because it's my text, but will be that example. But in New York, there was just a performance by Natalie Oshlami, and she revisited several iconic modernist choreographies, always by quoting some of the dance vocabularies, but also having someone engaging with it verbally. So it wasn't just dance studies discourses, but also like critics or poets also engaging with it. And the last performance was someone who worked, Tommy DeFrance, who was the archivist for Alvin Ailey for the longest time, and he was engaging with the piece and tried to one of the aspects that he was trying to do was saying we need to queer that dance, not just because Alvin Ailey himself himself was gay, but also like to rethink it. But what was more important about his work, and it took me, I didn't understand it at the time that he was performing it, but it was pointed out to me by another African American scholar that Tommy DeFrance demanded that we stop enjoying a revelation. He like and I found that, and Alvin Ailey was one of the people that we sent out, like, or that America sent out for long, who really struggled with that role that he was given, and what to which countries he was sent, and what specifically we were doing with those bodies that we sent out, like, or that America sent. Sorry, I'm saying we because I'm having double citizenship now. So, it was really interesting that he said, like, we demanded that we stop enjoying that piece for what it is, especially as white people. So I found that very interesting, and it made me, I didn't even get it first, and it took me a while, and it was really about the physicality that was on display there in relation to that specific choreographic and historical content. So I found that very interesting, and not fully agreeing with it, but I think for thinking through that argument might be interesting.
Yeah. And it's still, I mean, it's still, they're coming.
Yeah, they're still on tour with
and
the
they're
State
still
Department.
always,
They're the
still
only ones
always,
left.
you know, but they always still perform Revelations.
Yeah, and you know, Ailey was trained at New Dance Group.
Yeah.
So you know, so it was actually the communist infusion that helped see the impulse
Right.
for Revelations,
Or
right?
yes.
And then what I found really fascinating is that when he was sent out on tour, the company was asked not to have all African Americans because otherwise it looked like America was segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's absolutely right. You have to look at it as a protest piece.
I was just thinking also with Cunningham and Graham's companies, and you pointed out that they had African American dancers, but still they were sort of white, projecting whiteness, I would say, in the way that they were integrated in the companies, and then touring a certain vision of a universal American, where race didn't matter, but it did. I think, and that's what Tommy's probably also saying with Revelations.
That certainly must have been the key troubling thing for Alvin Ailey.
Yeah.
But Ailey's company was always an integrated company.
Yeah.
It was never all black.
Yeah, but I think there is, I find at least one key difference between Alvin Ailey is that in terms of knowledge, right, in terms of technique, Alvin Ailey then is one of the early modern dancers who's going to bring back ballet, but also having an Africanist aesthetic. So there is also an attempt, at least, to create an interweaving of different ways of knowing
Yes,
and
absolutely.
articulating
Yes,
ideas,
yes.
while in Cunningham, however innovative we might want him to think, he's still subscribing to the notions of the torso as a unit, lines that dissipate, radially, geometrically and so forth. And so that's what I was trying to get to this. There is this heavily construction notion of neutrality, which is, tilted one way, yeah. But
Yes.
I just want to say one thing, because it's definitely not my area of expertise, but your question, Jens, really brought me to think about what was happening in places like Brazil, for instance, in Cold War, because, on the one side, the first school of dance in Brazil was founded in the 50s by Royal Ballet, right? And then we had, what we call modern dance. It's a mixture of Martha Graham and Valentine, sorry. But in the South, especially in the 60s, then we have Bolshoi, we have this Bolshoi school rooted there, right? And then of course in the 60s, the Brazilian politics was very aligned, with different factions of things. So it might be very interesting because it's such a wide, big country, and they had, needed, it couldn't produce itself, so it had needing from all. So it might have been like a battle camp between, an extension of Cold War, on stage. Yeah. maybe someone needs to dig that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I'm fascinated by the idea that Martha Graham had this like racially diverse company that she made a lot out of. So when they take Clytemnestra out or perform it in New York, Mary Hinkson, who's African American, can play Clytemnestra. Pearl Lang, Jewish, she can play Clytemnestra. Ethel Winter, WASP, for lack of a better term, she can play it. Everybody can play it, and yet Mary's called exotic, which she really resented. So there are all these negotiations. So these three women, as Clytemnestra, they project whiteness. Is that because of its engagement with the Western canon?
Yeah, possibly, I would say. It's also the whole Jungian underpinning
Yeah, it's all
of the
Jungian.
Martha
Yeah,
technique.
it's all Jungian.
And it's also not.
Whilst of course
economic.
I think Ray Snaffle from Jamaica and Martha Graham was also sort of a patron of the National Dance Theatre Company of Jamaica, and he would famously say, well, she wasn't the one to invent contract release from an African dance perspective. So I think,
Yeah,
of
and she
course,
claimed to
every
invent all
dance
this, right?
has contract release and has the pelvis, and certainly African dance forms. So I think that from those perspectives, universalism, when we look at the somatics of dance and the anatomy of dance,
Absolutely, yeah.
we can talk of maybe universalism on that level, but as soon as we're on the stage and representing Clytemnestra in the context of American modernism, it becomes sort of, I think, intersecting with white ideology or American ideologies.
You know, it's
And
also
so even for those dancers who are part of the company, who were African American, we would have to ask them really about their participation with the technique and performing Clytemnestra. I would also find that difficult to speak for them, whether they felt they had to sort of, whether this was whiteness or not. As you said, it becomes very theoretical,
Yeah,
but I still
Mary
think there is a problem.
Mary felt it was very much a universal part. She did not feel she was performing whiteness when she was doing it. She wouldn't have done it if she had. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something to
and
it.
dances of that generation and in
It's a
general
very
probably
different
don't
generation.
theorize their own performance in that way.
No, that's why
Yeah.
it's like that's her.
Which isn't to say that we couldn't look at it in that
Yeah,
way,
no,
in
yeah.
terms of representing a nation.
But what's
and certain
fascinating too
aesthetics.
is with this
Yeah.
Jamaican context, because her father was actually Jamaican, and in the Jamaican tradition, the pelvis is loose, right? But in the American Graham tradition, it is absolutely placed, right? It's highly controlled. In other words, your contraction can be a little bit deep, it can be a little bit deeper, depending on what you want to explain. So, Graham curates the pelvis, right?
Yeah, it's not to say that she didn't develop her own technique, but there's also sort of, scholars who have written about the influences of African American dances on the American modern dance.
And there's
so-
appropriation, and then the whole process of invisibilization, and then whitewashing, and I think so. There is layers and layers. So this universal is constructed. It's a huge process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
It's exhausting.
Yeah, there's no question that it's a construct. I mean, and to the advantage of the United States. I mean, that's what it's kind of there for, really. So,
And heightened in the Cold War.
yeah, I mean, we're talking, traditionally, every modern dancer was to invent his or her own technique.
Yeah.
It was not supposed to be institutionalized at all. And in fact, Lincoln Kirstein said that's why modern dance will not survive. He was a little wrong about that, but that it wouldn't survive because it was dependent on the personality of the dancer and not on an academic technique.
And
So
money.
it wouldn't survive.
Yeah, money went that way too. So I've been reading the Ford Foundation grant proposals, and the ageism and the bias against modern dance is incredible. It's they literally did not get money because of this.
Well, now Martha Graham is a technique that one can take and
That's right,
become
of course.
certified.
And so it's Cunningham.
Yeah, and I think in its structure and in its attempt, it's both of them, the universalization is clearly connected to whiteness. I mean,
Yeah.
really clearly. And no matter what you are thinking you are doing in it, you are aligning yourself with that because that's what
Yeah.
that abstraction requires, and
Yeah.
otherwise it wouldn't work. So their bodies, if you start acknowledging, you are not abstracting anymore. So
Yeah.
in the same way that modernism requires you.
Yeah, and it's funny because Mary Hinkson did something with Donald McHale. She was the woman, she was the original woman
Mhm.
in, what's the chain
A
gang?
rainbow around my shoulder.
Rainbow Around My Shoulder. And I was with her and she was watching pictures of herself and you know, she's got a very flexible torso and she looked, she said, what was I doing there? How could I do that? And it was fascinating. Her experience of that versus Graham technique.
Great. I think we're coming up to, yes. Any last questions? Very short ones. Okay, thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you. It's been really great and wonderful conversation with all of you. And thank you, Lisa, and the Society for Dance Research. I mean, it's been fantastic. Really, really wonderful event. And thank you, too. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.